Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Have you ever thought, I know spring, but when it comes to interviews, I always mess it up? It is not because that you are not knowledgeable or you don't have any hands-on experience, but it is just because of the tricky interview questions that confuse you. You are not alone. Many a times, most experienced developers, including me, have faced the same issue. But not anymore. Hey guys, in this video, I will break down the top 25 tricky spring interview questions that has confused many developers including me, and I will show you how to answer this with confidence. Stay tuned till the end as I have got a surprise for you. Let us get started. Guys, now let us get started with the top 25 tricky interview questions in Spring. I have separated them based on modules: Spring Core, Spring Boot, Spring MVC and REST API, spring-data-jpa. First we will start with Spring Core. First question: what happens if a Spring Bean has a private constructor? You all know, if a class is annotated with @component, the IOC container will automatically create an object for that class. But if a class has a private constructor, the IOC container will not create an object for that class. In this scenario, it is mandatory that you need to have a static method which returns an object of a class. I have given an example over here. This is an employee class which is annotated with @component. It has a private constructor. So it is mandatory that you need to create a static factory method which returns an object of that class. Together with that, you should create a class that is annotated with @configuration. You need to add one bean definition which returns an object of the class. In our case, the bean definition is a method that is annotated with @bean. For returning that object, you will be calling the static method which creates the object. In our case, create instance is the static method which creates and returns an employee object. Okay. Next question. What is the difference between constructor based dependency injection and setter based dependency injection? First, let us see the definition. In case of constructor based dependency injection, the dependencies are injected via constructor. In case of setter based dependency injection, the dependencies are injected via setter methods. Example: create a constructor by adding the dependencies as parameter. The constructor doesn't have to be annotated with @autowired. It is enough just have a constructor that has the dependency as parameter. In case of setter based dependency injection, create a setter method for that dependency and add @autowired annotation. Okay. When to use constructor based dependency injection and when to use setter based dependency injection? Use constructor based dependency injection when the dependencies are mandatory. Use setter based when the dependencies are optional. In case of constructor based dependency injection, all the required dependencies are injected during the object creation time itself. That is, while creating the object, all the required dependencies are passed as parameters. So, you are getting a fully loaded object with all the dependencies added. In case of setter based dependency injection, first the object is created, then the dependencies are injected using setter methods. The dependencies can be changed later on. Because the objects are injected during the object creation time itself, constructor based dependency injection helps to create immutable objects. Setter based dependency injection is used for creating mutable objects, meaning to say that later on you can call the setter method to change the dependency details. Sometimes constructor based dependency injection may lead to circular dependencies. As in, we will see with an example. I have two classes, student and course. Student depends on course. So, I have a parameterized constructor with course as parameter. In the course class, course depends on student. I have a parameterized constructor in the course class with student as parameter. Now, when I try to create a student object, course object has to be injected while the student object is getting created. But course again depends on student. Student depends on course. So this leads to circular dependency. This can be avoided in case of setter-based dependency injection with the help of an annotation at lazy. Constructor-based dependency injection is clear, readable and concise. That is the code readability part. Why? Because I can have some 5 to 6 dependencies in my class. I will have one single constructor with all the dependencies added as a parameter. So the code is short, readable and concise. In case of setter-based dependency injection, based on the number of dependencies that I am having, I need to have that many number of setter methods. If I am having 6 properties which are dependencies, then I need to have 6 setter methods. Okay. Testability. Constructor-based dependency injection makes unit testing easier as all the dependencies are final. We are passing the dependencies as parameters. Once they are passed in the parameters, it means that they are final variables. In case of setter-based dependency injection, it allows mocking and modifying the dependencies during the testing phase. Because once the object is created, then only the setter method is getting called. Performance. It is slightly better as the dependencies are resolved during the instantiation time itself. I am trying to create an object. Whatever dependencies are needed should be injected during the object creation time itself. If it is not available during that time itself, I will get an exception and it can be resolved easily. But in case of setter-based dependency injection, once the object is created, then only the dependencies are getting added. So, it involves additional method calls, slightly reducing the performance. So, these are the differences between constructor-based and setter-based dependency injection. Next question. Can we create a Spring Bean without using add component? Yes. Whenever you want to create an object for a particular class, the IOC container will go and read the configuration metadata. They are of 3 types: XML based configuration, annotation based configuration and Java based configuration. XML based configuration is outdated. Annotation based configuration is where we use add component, which helps the IOC container to create an object for that class. Instead of that, we can also use Java based configuration, as in create a class that is annotated with add configuration. Add a method which is annotated with add bean. This is called as the bean definition. This method will return an object of that class. Even though you are using new keyword, you are not creating the object. The IOC container will create an object for this particular class based on the bean definition. It happens during the startup of your application. An example of a bean definition is given over here. In this case, a rectangle object is created by the IOC container. Okay. Can we have multiple bean methods of the same type in the Spring configuration class? Yes, of course. Suppose if I am having one interface shape with multiple implementation classes as in square, triangle and rectangle. For all these classes, I can have different bean definitions, that is different methods, just like what is given over here. I have got a bean definition for the rectangle class and the square class. Okay. What happens if more than one bean of the same type is available? In my case, I have a square interface, 2 implementation classes of that, rectangle and square. Now, while running the application, there will be a confusion whether to choose rectangle or square. Then, in this case, it will throw no unique bean definition exception. To avoid that, you need to pick and choose a particular bean. For that, we can use the annotation at primary. If at all we are using at auto-wired in the other class where shape is a property, we can also use at qualifier annotation. But if you are working only with Java based configuration, the annotation that is getting used is at primary. Next question. What is the difference between at component, at service and at repository? All these annotations are stereotype annotations. Before jumping into seeing the differences, first let us understand about these annotations. What is the use of at component? This is a general stereotype annotation that marks a Java class as a Spring managed bean. This is a parent annotation for at service and at repository. It can be used on any class that doesn't fit into service and repository layer. So, use at component annotation only for classes that are utility classes and helper classes. I have given an example below. This is an utility class which is returning the list of courses taken by a particular employee. So, this class can be annotated with at component. Next, what is the use of at service annotation? This is a specialized at component annotation which is used for classes that are dealing with business logic, transactional operations and service layer operations. That is, at service is used for service layer beans. Now, this annotation also helps to maintain a clean code and separation of concerns. Can I use at component instead of at service? Will my application work? Yes, it will work perfectly fine. But this is only for us to understand the class that is annotated with at service is responsible for handling business logic, transactional operations and service layer operations. It is exclusively for the developer only. Even if you notice, when you are working in a layered architecture, while creating the class also, you add service as a word for the class to inform that this is the service layer. Similarly, adding at service annotation means this class is responsible for taking care of business logic, transactional operations and service layer operations. What is the use of at repository? This is a specialized at component annotation which is used with DAO layer classes or interfaces. This indicates that a class or an interface that is annotated with that repository interacts with the database. If a class is annotated with that repository, this means we are using JDBC to connect with the database. If an interface is annotated with that repository, this means we are using spring-data-jpa to interact with the database. This annotation also provides exception translation. That is, it converts all the database specific exceptions like SQL exceptions into Spring specific data access exceptions. These are runtime exceptions. So, use at repository when you are working with spring-data-jpa, Hibernate or database related operation. An example of an interface that is annotated with at repository is given below. Now that we have understood about all these annotations, let us see the difference between them. Use at component for general purpose beans, that is for utility classes and helper classes. Use at service annotation for service layer beans, that is classes that are dealing with business logic or transactional operations or service layer operations. Use at repository for classes or interfaces that interact with the database. If a class is interacting with the database, this means that you are using JDBC. If an interface that is annotated with that repository is interacting with the database, this means you are using spring-data-jpa. Okay, this annotation also provides exception translations. That is, it converts JDBC specific exceptions, that is database specific exceptions like SQL exceptions, into Spring specific data access exceptions. All these three annotations can be detected by at component annotation. This means functionality wise they work in the same manner. Instead of using at service, you can use at component. Instead of using at component, you can use at service. But the only thing that you need to remember is the right annotation improves code readability and maintainability. Next, we will move on to the tricky interview questions in Spring Boot. Can we create a Spring Boot application without at Spring Boot application annotation? Yes, by using three other annotations. How? At Spring Boot application annotation is a combination of enable auto configuration, component scan and configuration. So, instead of using one single annotation, if you are using these three annotations also, your application will work perfectly fine. This means automatically your application will be bootstrapped and it will be ready to run. Next question. Can we run a Spring Boot application without an embedded server? Yes. When you are creating a Spring Boot application, if you have added Spring Web as dependency, automatically Tomcat server will be added. But if you want to run this application as a console based application, in this case, you need to add a property in the configuration file. That is an application.properties file. spring.main.web-application-type none. In this case, the embedded Tomcat server will not be considered. How to disable auto configuration in Spring Boot? By default, Spring Boot will auto configure certain classes based on the dependencies that you have added in your pom.xml. Suppose say you have added web as dependency, Spring Boot will automatically configure embedded Tomcat server. If you have added security as dependency, Spring Boot will automatically create a user with the name user and generate a password for that particular user. If you have added spring-data-jpa as a dependency, automatically the data source will be configured. But if you want to manually configure these classes, then you can add this particular annotation. That is to disable auto configuration. Use exclude, which is an attribute for at Spring Boot application annotation, equal to data source auto configuration dot class. This means the data source will not be automatically configured. Manually, you need to configure the data source for your application. Can we change the port number of a Spring Boot application without modifying application.properties? Yes. By default, a Spring application runs in port number 8080 because we are using embedded Tomcat server. If you want to change the port number, we can go to application.properties and add the configuration as server.port equal to a different port number. If you want to change the port number during the runtime, while running the jar file, we can provide the port number. As in, the command to run a jar file is java-jar, the jar file name. Together with that, provide the configuration details. Server.port equal to the port number in which you want to run your application. Next question. What happens if we have multiple application.properties file in Spring Boot? In this scenario, Spring Boot will run the properties file in the particular order. First, it will go inside the config folder of the jar file. It will read the application.properties and add the configuration details appropriately. Next, it will go in search of the properties file in the class path root, meaning to say that inside src main resources folder. Then it will go and read the configuration details from that particular file. Finally, it will go in for external config sources, that is from the external environment variables or from the command line arguments, just like what we have given over here. Or if you are having your configuration file in the repository, it can also read the configuration file from the repository. Okay, so the order is from the config folder, from within src main resources, from the external config sources. So the highest priority is given to the environment variables and the command line arguments, that is to external config sources. Next question. What happens if at Spring Boot application is used on an interface? Spring application will fail because you cannot create an object for an interface. We will move on to the next part. Tricky questions in Spring MVC and REST API. What is the difference between at controller and at REST controller? You might be knowing it, but still let us have a look. Before jumping into the difference, first let us see what is the use of at controller and at REST controller. What is the use of at controller? At controller is an annotation which is used above classes in MVC applications, which returns the view page. The views can be in the form of HTML, JSP, time leaf or velocity. A class that is annotated with at controller has methods which returns the view page name. The dispatcher servlet uses view resolvers to identify the location of the view page name. If you want the method to return the JSON data or the payload or the body part directly, then together with @controller, you can also use @response_body, or together with getMapping, use @response_body. An example of a class that is annotated with @controller is given below. What is the use of @REST_controller? A class that is annotated with @REST_controller is used with REST APIs, that is used for developing REST applications. This is a combination of @controller and response_body. In this case, a class that is annotated with @REST_controller has methods which returns the JSON data or the payload or the body part. This annotation can be used only with REST APIs. An example is given below. This is the class that is annotated with @REST_controller. The method returns the JSON data. Now we have understood what is @controller and @REST_controller. Now let us see the difference between @controller and @REST_controller. @controller is an annotation that is used with classes in MVC applications that returns the view pages. @REST_controller is an annotation that is used with classes in RESTful web services. In case of a class that is annotated with @controller, it has methods which returns the view page name. The view page can be in the form of HTML, JSP, timely for velocity. If you add @response_body together with that, you will get the JSON data directly. A class that is annotated with @REST_controller has methods that returns the JSON data or the body part or the payload directly. So, @controller handles UI based views. REST_controller handles REST APIs. If you want to build a website, use @controller annotation because it has the view pages that is a part of it. If you want to build REST API, use @REST_controller. Next question. What happens if we use @request_mapping on a method without specifying a path? In this case, the method will handle the request that is coming from the class level request mapping. Let me explain this with an example. Here I have a class that is annotated with @REST_controller, and I have request mapping that is added in the class level and also in the method level. In the class level, the path is provided properly. In the method level, the path is not provided. In this case, what will happen? Automatically, this method will handle the request that is coming from the class level request mapping. But if you are having more than one method that is annotated with @request mapping without path means, then there will be a conflict because all the methods are trying to use the same class level request mapping, which is not possible. Next question. What happens if @getMapping method in REST API returns null? If null is returned, then Spring returns 204 no content. 204 is the status code. If an exception is thrown from this particular method, Spring returns 500 internal server error. What happens if we send a post request to a getMapping? In my application, I have a method that is annotated with @getMapping. I want to test it. So while testing it using Postman, if I am using post method instead of get means, I will get an exception. Method not allowed exception. Next question. What happens if two REST endpoint methods annotated with getMapping have the same path? An example is given over here. I have two methods that are annotated with @getMapping and they are having the same path, that is the same URL pattern. In this case, Spring will throw an error at startup. Next, let us move on to the tricky questions in spring-data-jpa. What happens if we don't define an ID field in a JPA entity? While working with Hibernate or JPA, it is mandatory that an entity should have a primary key. So for this, a class that is annotated with @entity should have one property that is annotated with @id. If you don't add this annotation, then Hibernate will throw an exception. What is the difference between fetch is equal to fetch type.lazy and fetch is equal to fetch type.eager? Fetch is equal to fetch type.lazy. In this case, this will load the associated or the related entities lazily. Meaning to say that the data will not be pulled up immediately. Only when you ask for the data will be retrieved from the database. Fetch is equal to fetch type.eager. In this case, it loads all the related entities while pulling up the main entity. Let us see this with an example. While working with one-to-many and many-to-many, the fetch type is by default lazy because for one entity you are having a list of many related entities, that is on the many side. So to avoid bad performance, the fetch type by default is lazy. Let us see this with an example. At one-to-many and many-to-many, both of them have the fetch type as lazy. For example, one student taking many courses, one course having many students. Here the relationship is many to many. For one student, I need to pull many courses from the database. So by default, here the fetch type is lazy. Only when you ask for the courses will be retrieved or pulled from the database. If you want to pull it immediately together with the student entity, then you need to use fetch is equal to fetch type.eager. Similarly, for one-to-many, one product having many offers. By default, the fetch type is lazy. If you want to pull all the offers for the product immediately, you need to change fetch type.eager. The example is given below. One product having many offers. So here the fetch type is eager. Okay. What should we do if we do not want to save a property or an instance variable in the database? It is very simple. The annotation that we need to use is @transient. Next question. How to store a list of string values in database using data.jpa? Use the annotation @elementCollection. Here the data type is a list of string or list of integer. If the data type is a list of user defined classes, then we will be going in for association mapping, one to one, one to many, many to one and many to many. But if your class is working with a list of string values, you need to use @elementCollection. In this case, in terms of Java classes, you have one single class, that is the main entity class. But in terms of the tables, there will be two different tables. One is the main entity table, the other one is the table relevant to this particular list. If you want to give your own table name, you can use @collection table as an annotation. Next question. How to save the child entity automatically while saving the parent? While working with association mapping, while the parent entity is getting saved, automatically the child entity should be saved to the child table. For example, I have an employee class with address as an instance variable. Address is annotated with @1to1. While saving the employee object, the address object should be saved to the address table. For this, together with the annotation @1to1, use the attribute cascade. Cascade equal to cascade type.all or cascade type.persist. This means before the parent entity is saved to the parent table, the child entity will be saved to the child table. In our case, address will be saved to address table, then employee object will be saved to employee table. Can we execute a native SQL query in spring-data-jpa? Yes. While working with custom queries, we will be using @query annotation above the method. By default, this query annotation takes JPQL. If you want to work with native SQL query, you need to add two attributes. One is value, which takes the native SQL query. The other one is native query, which takes a boolean value. By default, it is false. But if you are passing native SQL query, you need to add this attribute and assign the value as true. Next question. Can we execute stored procedure using spring-data-jpa? Yes. Using @procedure annotation. There are different ways of calling stored procedure from spring-data-jpa. In all these ways, the method should be annotated with @procedure annotation. Now, let me just talk about two ways. In one way, just give any method name annotated with @procedure within which pass the procedure name. The other way is your method name and the procedure name should be same, and this method also should be annotated with @procedure. These are two different ways in which you can call the stored procedure in a database using spring-data-jpa. What happens if we don't use mapped by in a bidirectional relationship? This mapped by attribute is used to tell who owns the relationship. This can be used only in a bidirectional relationship. Let me explain this with an example. Many products belong to one brand. One brand has many products. So, in this case, I have my product class which is having brand as a property. I have my brand class which is having list of products as property. Here we have used mapped by attribute which says who is the owner of this relationship. In our case, product is the main entity. Product has brand as a property. This brand is the owner of this relationship. So that is what is passed as value in mapped by. If I don't use this mapped by attribute, Hibernate will automatically create an extra foreign key column in the brand class, which may lead to inconsistency. This means it will consider many products belonging to one brand, which is one relationship, one brand having many products, which is the second relationship. In our case, this is one single relationship having bidirectional relation. So, it is mandatory that you need to use mapped by. So, if you use mapped by, automatically you are telling there is one single relationship and one particular property is the owner of this relationship. That property name is passed as value for mapped by. I hope it is clear. We have seen the top 25 tricky interview questions in Spring. You might be wondering few other questions are missed out here. If you know those questions, please do share it in the comments. We will discuss it further in some other video. There is also one other category which is called as most commonly asked interview questions in Spring. Of course, we will deal with that also in some other video based on different modules. Okay guys, I have an announcement to make. I am starting with a fresh Java full stack trading batch from April 7th. If you guys are in testing, support, production, looking forward to switch your career into Java full stack development, then this is the right time. I have given the details in the description. Click on the link to understand about the process and book a free call to discuss about your career roadmap. I am waiting for your call. That's it. Let us learn, code and grow together. Thank you.